1973, Newark, New Jersey is gripped by a major heroin epidemic. The vast housing projects are rife with drug addicts overdosing. Law enforcement is desperate to find a solution. Richie Roberts is the head of a special narcotics task force in New Jersey. He's the key prosecutor depicted in the movie American Gangster.
Newark, Camden, Trenton, wherever there was a inner city and a minority population, you could see addicts lying on the street corners, sleeping in their cars. You could find needles on the streets. You could find needles in playgrounds. It's hard for me to believe my own mind pictures because it was that bad.
Officers from Richie's New Jersey Special Narcotics Unit are responding to a report of 2 dead bodies in a Newark housing project. They first find the body of a young boy.
Kids of heroin addicts, if God forbid both the mother and the father are addicts, they're on their own from day one. Have we discovered kids ingesting heroin back in those days? Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody purposely gave it to them, but it's laying around these houses all the time.
When they find the boy's parents, both are dead from overdoses of heroin.
You can't overstate how bad the problem was. You really can't. It was horrible. It was just horrible. Heroin, in particular, was out of control.
Behind this new epidemic is a previously unknown brand of heroin.
The glassine envelopes are marked with the brand, Blue Magic.
But nobody knows where Blue Magic is coming from or who is behind it. Across the Hudson River, Blue Magic also has New York City in its grip.
Early 1970s, it was estimated, probably a low estimation, that there were about 500,000 heroin addicts in the United States, 200,000 of them in New York alone.
Well, it was a massive problem. It was very difficult to deal with the traffickers in an effective and efficient manner because there were so many of them. So much heroin was being imported into the city. Many people got involved because the monies to be earned by this criminal element were enormous, and it was a very difficult problem.
The Federal Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, formed in 1973 to combat drug crime around the country. Their primary focus in New York City is the mafia.
When you look at the mafia, the 5 families of the mafia, the Bonanos, the Colombos, Gambinos, Genoveses, and Lucchese's, they were headquartered in New York City with distribution tentacles and captains and bosses around the country.
Historically, the mafia controlled 80% of the heroin trade. It came into the US from Turkey via the infamous French connection. The mafia refined the heroin in Marseille, France, before shipping it to New York City. Often smuggled in the hollow spaces of cars. But when the US government financed the destruction of Turkish poppy fields, they thought they had cut the heroin supply off forever. But out of nowhere, Blue Magic floods the market. Purer, cheaper, and more addictive.
I can't remember how many people a week or a month were dying from overdoses and other causes, but it was terrible.
New York as a whole was always the major point where the drugs would come in before they'd even be filtered off to Detroit or Chicago. But Harlem by the 1970s was really the epicenter of drug distribution, particularly heroin.
Users are all ages and from all walks of life. The effects of heroin are indiscriminate.
I had a family member, a dear cousin. He got on stuff. He said, I gotta get out. I'm gonna kill myself.
Finding the source of blue magic is the cops' urgent priority.
We were told, stop this epidemic. Our main focus was to find out where the heroin was coming from, how it got up into the Jersey area, and to stop it.
December 1973, New York. The DEA decides to start at the bottom of the chain and work up. They arrest two known distributors, Mario Perna and Tony Vazzino. The cops hope these mafia distributors will lead them to the man behind the heroin.
When Perna and Vazzino were arrested, they were in possession of an enormous quantity of heroin, which was earmarked for Frank Lucas.
Frank Lucas was already on the police radar. Could the Harlem heroin dealer be the man behind Blue Magic?
We knew about him going back to at least 1970 or thereabouts, but could not make a case on him.
A subsequent raid on Vazzino's apartment provides the cops with hard evidence linking the mafia to Frank.
He had paperwork on him, his quote, books, which named Lucas and the wholesalers by code name and their real telephone numbers.
Under questioning, Perna and Vazzino name Frank. It's the final piece of evidence the cops need. It's obvious the authorities are dealing with a major player. But who is Frank Lucas? The story starts in Harlem 8 years earlier. Back then, Frank Lucas was a low-level drug pusher from North Carolina who had been dealing heroin in Harlem for 5 years.
Frank Lucas obviously had some street sense to come from the South and set up shop in the epicenter of narcotics dealing in New York City. He had something.
Frank was getting his heroin from the mafia. Progressing from a small-scale thief, Frank is impressed by the amount of money heroin brings in. If he can move up the food chain, he can make even more. But he needs to make a name for himself.
Frank Lucas, like any other rising drug lord, in order to become that, you have to attain some kind of reputation on the street.
Frank lends a street thug named Tango a kilo of heroin to make a deal. But when Frank wants his money, Tango doesn't pay up. Frank takes the opportunity he's been waiting for. Tango's death pushes Frank up the ladder.
Frank was quite comfortable in telling the story of how he killed someone, which will certainly give you street credibility.
It's the kind of ruthlessness that draws the attention of Harlem's big fish. And it isn't long before he gets his chance to move up the chain. Harlem, New York, 1966. Frank is hustling pool in a club on 7th Avenue. Also hustling that night is Ice Pick Red, a local thug known for being a ruthless contract killer.
Ice Pick said, I want to play you for $1,000.
It's a dangerous challenge. Frank tries to lower the risk, but Ice Pick refuses. He isn't a man to cross. Suddenly, the stakes are unexpectedly raised.
In walks Bumpy Johnson, right? Dressed to the nines, the legend.
Bumpy Johnson has made his bones with one of the most powerful families in organized crime.
Bumpy rose up through and became an associate, a friend of the Genovese crime family. So by the 1950s, early 60s, Bumpy Johnson was a legend, not just in Harlem, but in greater New York.
It was essentially a contact with the Italian mafia. And he sort of handled a lot of their affairs within the Harlem community.
Harlem's most powerful heroin dealer heard about Frank's slaying of Tango. Now he wants to test him against a real thug.
He says, "Can you beat him?" to Frank. Can you beat this guy? And Frank says, "Yes, I can." So he backs him, and then dramatically, Frank Lucas runs the table, right, and wins the money.
Frank proves himself to the most powerful man in Harlem, and it pays immediate dividends.
Bumpy Johnson takes him under his wing, supposedly shows him, how to be a real gangster.
It's a significant step in Frank's career as a heroin dealer, and it isn't long before the heroin business undergoes a revolution. Harlem, New York, 1970. 4 years after Harlem drug dealer Frank Lucas became Bumpy Johnson's confidant, the heroin kingpin dies at the age of 62. Ex-thief turned heroin dealer, Frank Lucas is now the most powerful man in Harlem and seamlessly takes over Bumpy's position in the mafia supply chain.
Frank worked with Ralph Titino, who was a boss in the Lucchese crime family.
Since his introduction to high-ranking mafia boss Ralph Titino, Frank's profits are booming. And he demands increasing amounts of heroin.
Frank would get heroin from 3 to 50 kilos a weekly basis all the time during the late 60s and 70s.
Heroin demand is on the up and up in Harlem. 15,000 drug addicts live in the area, with addiction rates 12 times the national average. But after the DEA's destruction of the French Connection, the mafia's ready supply of heroin dries up. As supply reduces, prices rise, and Frank's profits are squeezed. Before long, Frank finds himself in serious debt to the mafia.
Every drug lord began to resent the mafia. The mafia charged quite a fee to import. They were the king of the importation of narcotics. Frank Lucas had tallied up some considerable debts to the mafia. Every drug dealer on the rise tends to tally up some debts, but Lucas's was, according to some stories, becoming dangerous levels.
The DEA were monitoring on the wire some Italian gangsters, right? Italian-American gangsters. And they were talking about killing Frank because he owed over $300,000 to them.
The mafia are bad news for Frank. He is desperate to pay off his debts and find a new, reliable source to feed his customers.
I think that beginning in the early 70s, and Frank wasn't unusual in this, I think a lot of dealers were looking for new supplies of drugs.
And with the arrival of Blue Magic, it's clear that they found it. And Frank is making more money than ever. January 1973. Frank's cutting operation is in full swing. And Frank does everything he can to maximize his profits.
Frank would bring people in to cut the heroin, very professional operation.
And Frank did everything he could to ensure that his customers wouldn't be tempted by other brands.
And they wanted to corner the market. And the way they did it was to put a greater percentage of heroin in the package. In Jersey, it could be as low as 1% heroin, 3% heroin.
Frank's product is nearer to 10%.
When an addict gets a product that gives him a better and longer high, they're going to gravitate to that product.
Branding has also been key to Frank's success.
Blue Magic was Frank's brand. It was a brand name he gave his heroin. The addicts would ask for, is this Blue Magic?
Even heavily cut Blue Magic offers a greater high than the competition, and is making Frank a very wealthy man.
Lucas was bringing out at least $1 million in cash a week. $1 million a week in profit.
But Blue Magic is proving deadly.
The serious problem was if they put 10% in, which they did originally, even 6-7% heroin, people are not used to that. And they started ODing. And that's what actually caused everybody to be excited about it, was that the drug populace were ODing on this brand new product called Blue Magic, which had a greater percentage of heroin, and people couldn't handle it, but everybody wanted it because it gave them a better high.
August 1973. It's clear that Frank's operation is bigger than the cops had thought. Blue Magic spreads beyond New York and into New Jersey. Distribution is being handled by Frank's family, including his 17-year-old nephew and his brother, Shorty Lucas. They call themselves the Country Boys. Shorty quickly develops a reputation as a brutal enforcer.
Shorty was brutal. I mean, he was as brutal or more brutal than Frank.
The new street gang's violent reputation, encouraged by Frank and Shorty, spreads fear across New Jersey.
When they had a dealer who was short packaging them or whatever reason, they would kill him. We found bodies at the base of the projects. They were thrown off the roof.
Shorty takes control of the streets by killing off rival dealers and replacing them with his own soldiers.
They had different locations all over the place where they cut the heroin and packaged them in the glassine envelopes and sold them on the streets. Noticed that the old dealers on the streets were being tossed off, and guys were coming on, and women on occasion, with Southern accents. So it wasn't too hard to figure out who they were.
Harlem, New York, 1973. Blue Magic has turned Frank's fortunes around, and he now has an estimated $50 million hidden in Cayman Island bank accounts. He likes splashing out at one of Harlem's coolest night spots, Small's Paradise.
He was notorious in terms of his expenditures, like, you know, to show people how wealthy he was. And that, of course, attracted the attention of DEA and the government.
It's the point at which Richie Roberts enters the story.
I had a friend of mine in DEA in New York, and he took me there one night. And that was the first time I saw Frank. Everybody knew him. People were coming over, shake his hands. I mean, really want to keep a low profile. That's not the way to play. But, you know, good-looking guy, beautiful women around him, good-looking guys around him. He thought of himself as a businessman. He wanted to make money. And he thought of himself as a black man making inroads into a white business. And he was proud of that. He was very charismatic. He was illiterate. He's still illiterate. He knows how to count money very well.
But Roberts isn't fooled by Frank's charm.
Frank was not an urbane individual. Frank did not wear Armani suits. He didn't spout philosophy, killed people. He was a stone killer. Everybody was afraid of him. That's how he made his money. That's how he spread his poison about, because he was Frank Lucas. Mess with me and you're dead.
But though he likes to play the glamorous playboy, everyone knows what he is capable of.
Frank was not cultivated or cultured or extremely intelligent. He was a brute. He was a menace on the street. Very difficult person. Many people were afraid of him.
Richie Roberts has seen with his own eyes that Frank is making a lot of money, but he still has no idea where Blue Magic is coming from. The hunt is on. 1974, Newark, New Jersey. Heroin overdoses are rising across the city. Richie Roberts pulls together a group of investigators known as the Z Team to step up the war against Frank Lucas.
We wanted to know where they were cutting the stuff. We wanted to know how it was coming up. We wanted to know how Frank was able to control this. We did everything possible to determine that.
Roberts sends a sample of Blue Magic for analysis.
Through the chemist, we discovered the difference in the quality of the heroin, that it was going way up. They also can tell you what part of the world it was coming from.
The results surprise them.
It's coming from Asia. So we had a heads up immediately as to where poppies were being grown. We didn't know how it came into our country.
The only person who knows the answer is Frank. And Roberts is determined to find out. In New York, the DEA and the NYPD are also onto Frank Lucas. But everyone is keeping their cards close to their chests.
At the time I was involved, I knew very little of what New York was doing. I knew they were investigating, but I was under instructions just to, keep whatever we're doing to ourselves. I assume they were as well. Because don't forget, there was a lot of corruption, police corruption in those days. And I know they didn't trust us, and I didn't trust them. No one was telling me what investigations they were doing or how close they were to indictments, and nor was I talking to them.
In the end, it's not Richie Roberts, but the New York authorities who get to Frank Lucas first. January the 18th, 1975. Frank Lucas is at home with his wife, Julie.
Frank Lucas, we have a warrant. Tell the rest to search the truck team.
When we executed that search warrant at Lucas's house, we were hoping to find currency, which would tie Lucas to a major heroin ring.
The raid delivers more than they could ever have hoped.
The DEA found at his house an enormous amount of cash, 20s and 10s, all street money. Lucas's wife tried to hide a couple of $100,000 by throwing it out the window in the presence of the DEA agents. That was very important proof.
In total, nearly $585,000 in cash is seized.
I remember at the trial, when we had to prove it, we had to bring in like 7 or 8 suitcases.
Frank Lucas and his wife are both charged. Julie for obstruction of justice. And Frank for conspiracy to distribute heroin. 1976. With Frank Lucas now serving a 40-year jail term, the police hope that the flow of cheap and potent blue magic will dry up. But the heroin is still on the streets. Whoever is distributing blue magic, it isn't Frank. Richie Roberts' New Jersey team are no closer to knowing where it is coming from. Then they get a tip-off.
We had information that a package was coming up from North Carolina. It was coming to one of the projects and one of the apartments in Newark. We had let packages come before because we wanted the big picture. We wanted to see if we could trace where it was coming. I thought to myself, and there was argument, let it go. Let's try to follow the people who, are selling it. I said, wow, if we let this stuff out on the street, there's gonna be a lot of dead people out on the street. And there's gonna be a lot of people exposed to it who never were exposed to it. I said, take it down. Take the package down.
Busting through the door, Richie Roberts' Z team find Frank's family street gang still alive and kicking. This takedown nets $10 million worth of heroin. And when the cops arrest the country boys, one of them is Frank's 17-year-old nephew.
That amount of drugs, back in the 70s, a New Jersey judge was gonna give him life.
Facing life in jail, the kid begins to talk.
He just remembered everything, gave details, was specific, what to do with the drugs, where to take them, where to concentrate. We got the Jersey end of it from the dime bag dealer on the street to Shorty, who controlled Jersey, and above him, Frank.
The nephew's information lands Frank with another 30 years in jail. A grand total of 70 years with little hope of freedom. So Frank Lucas flips. Exposing a network of corrupt cops. And then leaving jail as a free man. This is how the movie American Gangster tells it. But the real story is very different. What the cops really want to know is where's the blue magic coming from? Who is the real man behind the tsunami of suffering that the supercharged drug has caused?
It wasn't just, Newark, New Jersey. It was New York. It was wherever they could sell it. I've heard from DEA agents during this time that they found blue magic in California.
Desperate for freedom, Frank tells them what they want to know.
Frank testified on the record that he went to Bangkok, Thailand, for the purposes of connecting with a major heroin source there and basically cut out the mafia so he could deliver direct from Thailand into the United States of America.
The more Frank talks, the more incredible the story becomes. The route the heroin takes into the US is simply astonishing. 1972. The story starts here, 3 years before Frank's arrest. At this time, he is deep in debt to the mafia and holed up in a secret hideaway. But he is unexpectedly thrown a lifeline. He meets a heroin importer who offers him the deal of his life. Frank could make a fortune and cut the mafia out.
Frank Lucas likely met him through a mutual friend or a family member. They were both from the South. Nobody on Earth seemed to know who he was and liked it that way.
The man claims to run a vast heroin smuggling operation from Southeast Asia, worth $50 million a year.
Frank, of course, was eager to get access to this supply, which eventually became Blue Magic. It gave him freedom from the Italian-American mafia. He didn't have to work with them. It was such a high quality that he can make more money.
He agrees to supply Frank, but before he leaves, Frank has a favor to ask. He needs money to pay back the mafia. Sensing Frank could be useful, he takes a chance.
He ended up loaning $25,000 to Frank Lucas to pay that debt off. At this point, he was like one of the major drug dealers in the world. I mean, he was making all kinds of money, so he could afford it.
Frank reveals the real mastermind behind Blue Magic. A dealer the cops already have in custody, Leslie Ike Atkinson. Within 2 years, Frank Lucas has become extremely wealthy, but he wants promotion. When Ike Atkinson's second-in-command is put in jail, Frank makes his move. He heads to Thailand to make an offer he thinks Ike can't refuse. Bangkok, Thailand. Frank is at Ike's center of operations, Jack's American Star Bar. Ike listens to Frank's pitch to become his business partner.
Ike was always wary of Frank. You know, he didn't fully trust him. And he told him, yes, you know, we can work out something.
But Ike doesn't want to give Frank any control within his organization. He wants him as his dealer in Harlem.
Ike says, I'm going to be the boss. I'm going to be controlling the distribution, and I'll give you the drugs. But it's not exclusively you. You know, I'll be dealing with other people.
It's a rejection Frank will never forget. And he knows he's lost out on multi-millions of dollars. Now, in the interrogation room, Ike will pay for turning his back on Frank. Frank is about to tell the cops the astonishing story behind Blue Magic and the ex-master sergeant in the US Army behind the operation, Ike Atkinson. (1968), Vietnam. The war is still raging. Retired Army Sergeant Ike Atkinson spots an opportunity with a former military colleague, Herman Jackson, to supply the US with high-grade heroin. Ike and Jackson buy cheap heroin from the poppy fields of the Golden Triangle in Laos, Burma, and Thailand. Ike smuggles the heroin into US bases in North Carolina on board military aircraft.
Atkinson tried smuggling some heroin himself aboard military aircraft back to the States, was successful in doing that.
It's so successful, he expands his operation using a network of active GIs to transport the heroin.
Slowly but surely, he built this network using soldiers that were going back to the United States on leave. And the US military were not paying attention. They were in a war.
After 4 years, the authorities start to suspect heroin is entering through US military bases. But how?
Authorities were aware of narcotics coming into the country. They knew somehow the military or military people were involved in this. But nobody knew who Ike Atkinson was for several years, just the way Ike Atkinson liked it.
With extra scrutiny at military customs, Ike's operation had to get creative.
There are these small overnight bags. The GIs called them AWOL bags. Absent without leave, you know, it's just a small gym bag type thing made out of leather. They would sew in a false bottom. Under that false bottom, there'd be about 700 grams of pure heroin.
Ike develops even more ingenious smuggling methods. Film canisters, soldiers wearing leg casts, while building a network of at least 50 associates and hundreds of GIs in the process.
And just say, hey, can you take this back with you? Somebody to pick it up from you. Others, they paid. Others, they relieved debt from their gambling.
Ike continues to keep one step ahead of the authorities.
Came up with an ingenious way of shipping heroin using teak furniture.
As much as 100 kilos of heroin at a time was squeezed into hollowed-out furniture bound for the US.
He was looking for an opportunity to make a few huge shipments that would set him up for the rest of his life.
buying a kilo of heroin for $4,000 and selling it for $100,000 nets a profit of $96,000 per kilo. Ike begins to amass a vast fortune.
They'd take the 1 pure kilogram of heroin and make 4 kilograms of 25% pure heroin and sell each one for $25,000.
And Ike has a vast network of dealers, each demanding more and more of his purer product.
He had customers throughout the East Coast of the United States, not only New York City, but Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C. He had customers out on the West Coast.
The DEA says that between 1968 and 1975, he made $400 million, which today's money would probably be closer to $1.2 billion.
The DEA administrator at a news conference said that it was probably the largest smuggling organization of Asian heroin in history. Atkinson, in the drug world, was the kingpin. He had the dope, and he who has the dope rules.
Trying to evade the DEA, Ike continues to use military aircraft to smuggle pure heroin through military bases for years. Frank Lucas is about to bring the whole enterprise crashing down. June 1975. Frank Lucas's information is explosive. What remains of Ike Atkinson's network is also arrested.
As far as I know, as far as I was told by the feds in New York, he gave up everybody.
He was informing on his criminal associates. I mean, people he did business with, people in his organization, people in other organizations. As a result of Frank's cooperation, I believe well over 100 people were convicted of narcotic distribution.
Lucas gave significant information. I'm not saying he gave everything he knew, but he gave, I'm going to say, maybe 60% of what he knew.
Already charged with heroin trafficking, the cops now realize the extent of Ike's organization. It is estimated that his smuggling network into the US is worth $50 million a year. And yet outside the DEA, few people even knew he existed.
The key ingredient to Ike Atkinson's success was that no one knew who he was, and the reason why they didn't know is the system. These former and current military men had access to airplanes. They weren't questioned. They could bring it right over, no questions asked.
Ike pleads guilty and is sentenced to 19 years in jail. The dogged work of Richie Roberts, his Z-Team in New Jersey, and members of the DEA in New York have finally seen Frank, Ike, and their networks brought down. Frank's cooperation sees his 70-year jail sentence reduced to just 6. Frank is freed in 1981. The #1 heroin dealer in Harlem, the boss of a brutal criminal gang that controlled the streets through murder and violence, who delivers the real heroin kingpin, is a free man.
But it paid off for him because he was able to get out of jail early.
Frank Lucas was probably one of the major heroin traffickers in the New York City area. There's no question about that. But as far as taking the heroin trade from the Golden Triangle to the addicts in the street in New York City, and it's just not the case.
Frank's life may have inspired American Gangster, but Frank's real story is very different to the movie. And Frank's criminal history doesn't end there. Within only 3 years, Frank is back in jail again for dealing heroin. This time he is sentenced to 7 years, serves the full term, and is released in 1991. As for the man behind Blue Magic, after the initial sentence of 19 years in jail, Ike is given a further 13 for continuing his smuggling operation from inside prison. Ike is eventually freed in 2007, having served a total of 32 years. And when the film is released in the same year, Richie Roberts receives a surprising call from him.
He said that Frank, he was proud. I did most of that. Frank didn't do it. I controlled Asia, and I didn't get my credit. They think it's credit.
Then Ike threatens revenge on Frank.
What are you saying? He says, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to kill him. So I said to Ike, Ike, how old are you? He said, I'm 80. I said, Ike, you ain't killing anybody. Get a rocking chair. He's down in North Carolina. Sit on the porch, go by a river, watch the water go by. And he started laughing.
Ike died in 2014 at the age of 88. Frank Lucas, also 88, is still alive. With his mafia connections through Bumpy Johnson, Frank Lucas undoubtedly rose to become a large-scale heroin dealer in 1970s Harlem. But he got his heroin from Ike Atkinson. Ike was the real American gangster who created a smuggling operation unlike any seen before. For a decade, Ike's audacious network of military servicemen, planes, and bases that brought vast quantities of heroin from Southeast Asia into the US was unstoppable, until Frank brought him down. Frank Lucas was nothing more than his man in New York.